Greetings and welcome to another fashionably late review here at Words About Games. Amy here, and today I want to talk to you all about Martha is Dead. First of all, I want to give out some general information about the game. Martha is Dead is developed by LKA and published by Wired Productions and will be released on February 24th, 2022 on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, Xbox Series S, and PC via Steam, GOG, and the Epic Games Store. According to the game's store description, Martha is Dead is a dark first-person psychological thriller set in 1944 Italy that blurs the lines between reality, superstition, and the tragedy of war. Martha is dead, and her twin sister Julia, the young daughter of a German soldier, must alone deal with the acute trauma of loss and the fallout from her murder. The hunt for the truth is shrouded by mysterious folklore and the extreme horror of war that draws ever closer. I'm going to give out a content warning here. We are going to be discussing the themes and contents of the game, including psychological trauma, self-harm, dismemberment, and disfigurement of human bodies. And in the interests of disclosure, we were provided with a code to review this game. So diving into my general thoughts before I talk about the game in depth, I do want to say that Martha is Dead is a very, very uncomfortable game to play. And I'm not necessarily saying that as a bad thing. It's a horror game, and horror games are primarily designed to make players feel uncomfortable, usually through fear or tension. It's brutal, and it has a heavy focus on the psychological part of psychological horror. Like, there's definitely some scary moments and spooky goings on, and it explores some of its themes really well, though there are other parts of the game that don't quite land or hit as they probably should. Now, before I dive into my in-depth thoughts on the game, I want to take a moment to touch on the, quote, censored scenes in the game. I played Martha is Dead on Xbox Series S, and on PlayStation platforms, Sony has taken the decision to censor one scene and remove the interactivity of certain scenes, as well as giving players the option to skip those scenes entirely. I'll talk more about those scenes in depth towards the end of the review, as they are heavy with spoilers, and I'll make it clear when I'm about to talk about them for anyone wanting to avoid being spoiled in any way, or anyone who just doesn't want to hear me talk about some of the more brutal things that take place in this game. I also won't be including footage from any of those scenes in this video. So to jump into my more in-depth thoughts of Martha is Dead, I actually want to start by talking about the game's voice acting, which I know is a bit unusual for me or for a review. So Martha is Dead, by default, starts with Italian voice acting with English subtitles. And it does this because it's set in 1944 Italy, and the game wants to go for immersion over anything else. And one of the ways it's doing that is by having all of the people in the game talking Italian, because that's where they live. They're all Italian. I did try to turn the English language voice acting on for about 2 minutes. It's fine. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say the English voice acting is bad. It's fine, but like, there's something about this game. I don't know. I played like 99% of it in the Italian voice acting, with the Italian voice acting turned on, and honestly, it really did help with the immersion of the game. And it's really good voice acting. So I guess if you're going to play this game and you want to be fully immersed in the world, like, yeah, keep the Italian voice acting on. It's really, really good and really helps with the immersion in the world. And I wanted to shout it out right at the top of this review because I think it's really cool that the game starts you off with that enabled. So one of the big highlights of Martha is Dead is its atmosphere. It starts out really, really strong. And it has this atmosphere of dread and tension that never really lets up. It certainly comes and goes. Like, you're not always going to be at this high level of tension or anxiety or fear all the time, all the way through the game. But you are always going to have this sort of underlying fear of dread as you play through the game, which, it's a horror game. That's kind of what horror games do. And it holds its atmosphere really well. It ramps it up when it needs to ramp it up, and it ramps down when it needs to ramp down. And like, that ramp down is important, and something that some horror games don't really get is that, like, if you hold someone to like such a high level of fear, like, constantly, then they're going to become numb to that fear. And what Martha is Dead does quite well is that it knows when to loosen its grip somewhat, so that when it wants to ramp up that fear and tension and dread again, that it's more effective. Like any horror game that can make you scared to walk through a dark forest, even though nothing happens all the way through it, but you still feel fear and tension over what could happen, is doing something right, in my opinion. As far as the story of Martha is Dead goes, it's very heavily open to interpretation. You play as Julia, a young woman who is the daughter of a German general in 1944 Italy, who seems to be quite important in the Nazi war machine, even if he doesn't seem quite happy about that fact. Julia's twin sister, Martha, is killed, and this tragedy forms the basis of the rest of the story as Julia tries to make sense of and figure out what happened to her sister, navigating the blurring lines between reality and fantasy while there's like a backdrop of like the Second World War. And in the game's store description, it actually talks about blurring the lines between reality and superstition. And Martha is Dead does a really good job of that. Like, you might think you know what's going on, you might even know that you know what's going on, but as the game progresses, it does start to become pretty obvious that you might not even be able to trust the things that you see or do as being factual or actually happening. Like, contradictions start opening up, and it's really up to you, the player, to decide what's really happening and what isn't. Like, I'm sure there's a right answer to what happened in this game, but Martha is Dead does a pretty good job of letting you question everything and come to your own conclusions about what actually happened versus what was just a fantasy or a dream or just did not happen. And the game has a very strong opening hour that kind of pulls you in and pulls you through the rest of the game. Like, the opening sort of, I'd say, hour of the game is so compelling that even as the game falters slightly as you go through it, because of how strong the opening was, you want to see it through. You want to see what happens all the way through. The ending itself doesn't really have the impact it's going for because it feels quite truncated. Like, the game is an uncompromising exploration of its themes of dealing with trauma and dealing with loss, but the ending doesn't quite stick the landing because it feels almost like an afterthought. Like, it was kind of stuck to the end of this really brutal, uncompromising game, and then the developers decided we need to have this message at the end of the game and just kind of stuck it to the end of the game. I can't really go into too much detail without spoiling the entire narrative, so I'm not going to. But again, it feels like almost like the game was cut off at a certain point. There's also a secondary plot that tries to tie itself into World War II that feels like it actively takes away from the rest of the story. Like a side quest that doesn't really do anything for the rest of the game, and it kind of mucks up the pacing of the more compelling main storyline of Julia, Martha, her family, and the tragedy that has befallen them. So one of the big things you're going to be doing in Martha is Dead is photography. It plays quite a large and important role in the story. It's not really puzzle solving. You take photos and develop them at the development studio you've got underneath the house. And it adds a really cool layer of gameplay to what is basically a horror walking simulator. And I say that term with love. I really love a good quote unquote walking simulator. But you take photos and you develop them, and those photos will have things in them that will power you through to the next plot point or the next story beat. And it's pretty cool. Like, there's other stuff with like tarot cards and a lot of sort of folklore-ish, superstitious stuff. But the photography is sort of like the main part of the gameplay. And the game does some pretty neat things with it. And you'll also want to stop and take a lot of pictures when you're not actively fearing whatever might be lurking behind the trees or what the game is going to ask you to do next. Because the small slice of 1940s Tuscany that's presented in Martha is Dead is, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. Like, the camera tutorial has you take and develop a photo of a sparrow with the backdrop of like this beautiful Italian countryside. And while you will certainly take far more disturbing and macabre pictures to progress the story, you can whip your camera out anytime you want and take photos of anything you like. And you might want to, because this game has a lot of environmental beauty to it. Not only can you take some fantastic photos of this beautiful world that LKA has created, but this go at your own pace approach to story progression gives you the opportunity to slow down and take in the scenery, especially if you need a minute between scary or downright horrific moments. Kind of like the in-game equivalent of putting the controller down and just walking away from the game to compose yourself. The other reason you might want to put the controller down and walk away for a moment are the fiddly and sometimes frustrating movement controls. Like, this game's primarily about you walking around and occasionally performing, I don't know what really to call them. QTE. We'll go with QTE adjacent actions. And the controls just feel a little bit fiddly and can sometimes be frustrating. And sometimes you can get stuck because the QTE timings don't really match up with how QTEs work in a lot of other games. Like there's a chase sequence quite early on in the game, and the button prompt will appear. And if you push the button prompt when the button prompt appears, that actually fails the QTE because that's not the right time to push the button. The right time to push the button is when this like circle appears around the button prompt, which just it feels weird and really unintuitive. There's also like a bike that you can ride around on, but it feels really unnecessary. It has really dodgy controls that I never really got to grips with. And you can't really take the bicycle anywhere. Like, it seems like a really cool and interesting idea, right? Like, you've got this cool, awesome Italian countryside, and you can ride a bike around in it, but you can't really ride a bike around in it because you can't take the bike far away from the house. And that actually jives with a few other gameplay elements, which are introduced once and then never show up again, such as like listening in a door to a conversation between your parents. Like, you can do this once and you're prompted to do it, and there's like almost a tutorial of how to do it, and then you like never do it again in the rest of the game. So with all that being said, let's talk about the quote-unquote controversy for a moment, which is the scenes that Sony have censored on PlayStation versions of the game. And fair warning, I am going to be discussing things that will definitely spoil some plot aspects of the game, so I would leave now if you want to avoid that. And I'm also going to reiterate my earlier content warning. I am about to discuss scenes that involve self-harm, psychological trauma, dismemberment, and disfigurement of human bodies. So there's one scene in the game that is outright censored, some mentions of masturbation towards the end of the game, which is just really Sony. Oh no, masturbation. Can't have any mentions of sexual acts in games releasing on PlayStation. Oh, hello, Last of Us Part 2. So there are no other scenes that are necessarily censored in their entirety. There's a scene where you cut off a character's face and wear it like a mask, and a scene where you cut open a dead body and pull out a fetus, and both of those on PlayStation have had their interactivity removed, not necessarily been removed from the game. There is an option both in the menu and during play to skip those scenes entirely. Same with the scene depicting self-harm, but that's on all platforms, not just on PlayStation. And honestly, fair enough. These scenes make sense within the context of the game. They don't just exist to shock or disturb for the sake of shocking or disturbing. And they do play heavily into the themes and the story of the game. But like, as an Xbox player of Martha is Dead, I would definitely have loved an option to not have to actually cut open a dead body and root around inside for a fetus. Again, this isn't a passive cutscene. This is an active part of gameplay. You have to physically perform the actions yourself by pushing buttons and moving the analog sticks, which incidentally makes it impossible to look away because you need to know what buttons to push. It would have been nice to have that option to leave that as a cutscene is all I'm saying. Like, I get the impact the developers are going for with this scene, but for me personally, it would have had the same impact on me if it was a cutscene and I knew Julia was doing this rather than making me do it. Especially considering I had to do it twice because the game crashed after the first time I did it. I almost threw up. So my final thoughts on the game. Martha is Dead is brutal, disturbing, and tension-inducing psychological horror that's, well, it's definitely not for everyone. It's a mostly successful and wholly uncompromising look at the effects of trauma, mixing in supernatural elements and set to the backdrop of World War II. Its story doesn't always hit the mark, and it does lose some steam after an incredibly compelling opening. It also somewhat fumbles its ending, and the movement controls can get frustrating. But for people who get into it, Martha is Dead is a game that will stick with you for quite a while after the credits roll. Well, that's it for this review. Let us know what you think of the game. Did you like it? Are you in the middle? Or is it just not for you? Leave a comment down below. You know where the comments are on YouTube. Or hit me up on Twitter. All the info is in the description. I'm going to get out of here because I have tons more games to play and there's not enough time in the day, and also Elden Ring comes out tomorrow. I will see you next time.